Thanks very much, Humphrey, and thanks to UPF and to Robin for arranging this event and inviting me. I should just agree with Aidan about that this is a very confusing topic, North Korea in general. And I recall leaving Pyongyang after one of the many trips I made when I was a correspondent for CNN. And my producer turned to me and said, I am still confused, but at a higher level. And sometimes I feel all this discussion will leave us, I hope, confused, but at a somewhat higher level, because it is an exceptionally complicated issue. And human rights is a particularly difficult issue. And down the road, in terms of a transition to peace, it's very hard to envision. But in the current situation, it's still a very live issue. There's no question that the human rights situation inside North Korea is very grim, as many different reports and eyewitness accounts have shown over the years. But acknowledging this as an important issue and then thinking through what, if anything, might actually produce concrete improvements are two different things. President Biden has made clear that human rights is going to be a much bigger priority for the US government around the world than it was under President Trump, and Secretary of State Blinken mentioned human rights during his recent trip to Northeast Asia. But I think it's very clear that simply calling out the North Koreans on human rights isn't going to produce any change. Indeed, history shows that when North Korean leaders are pressured on this and on other issues, they tend to react by doubling down or pushing back. Pressure or sanctions might hurt North Korea, but there's very little evidence to show that it has ever produced a change in North Korean behavior of the kind that the international community has wanted to see. That's certainly the case in relation to human rights. And that's especially true given the nature of the North Korean state, where the leader is essentially revered like a god, and the state propaganda generally talks about what a wonderful place North Korea is. So publicly belittling them or laying out all the many ways that human rights are violated in North Korea, although I think it's important in terms of there being a historical record, it's not likely to lead to any meaningful improvement for the citizens of North Korea. Yet it's not impossible to conceive of ways in which a human rights dialogue with North Korea could get underway. Humphrey referred to my new book, Are You With Me, Kevin Boyle and the Rise of the Human Rights Movement. And one example is to look at Boyle, who was a founder and leader of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and then later became one of the world's foremost human rights lawyers, approached human rights in his own dealings with China. In 2008, he visited Beijing and gave a series of talks to think tanks and universities on human rights. But the focus was not on denouncing China. Instead, he used the talks to explain how the human rights system at the United Nations worked. He explained the various international human rights treaties and covenants. He talked about the link between development, security, and human rights. And he laid out a more expansive definition of human rights, such as the right to health, the right to education, which was somewhat closer to the Chinese definition. When it seemed appropriate in these conversations, he also raised the issue of freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of association, but not front and center, not in your face, and not as a vehicle for him as an outsider to come across as denouncing the Chinese system. And he got a surprisingly warm response. So I mention this because something similar, although perhaps even more cautious, might offer an initial opening for conversations with North Korea. North Korea is a signatory to the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's made international commitments to refrain from discriminating against the disabled. Various NGOs have worked on helping disabled people in North Korea. So that might be an entry point where you could actually have a conversation with North Korea with the hope of perhaps eventually expanding the range of topics. But it's also worth pointing out at the moment, there's no diplomatic process between the US and North Korea, as the other speakers have noted. There are layers of suspicion and distrust and ill will. So in my view, adding human rights as an immediate item on the any prospective agenda is likely to go nowhere. But if, for example, the US and North Korea can somehow begin a more sustained process of diplomatic engagement, and in the course of moving towards what might lead to eventually a meaningful improvement in relations, maybe even at some point down the road, the establishment of liaison offices, really trying to break down all this ill will, then human rights certainly belongs on the agenda. And under those kinds of circumstances, it's not impossible to envision some progress. One other point about human rights. There is certainly an argument to be made that economic development itself helps expand the rights of citizens. That's especially true if you look at Vietnam or the experience of China, where in terms of people acquiring greater personal as opposed to political freedom, greater choices in terms of lifestyle, work, marriage, residence, travel, and so on. If you compare China now, even with the tightening under Xi Jinping in recent years, to the China that I saw when I first visited in 1973, it's like night and day. So to me, what that means is that if North Korea's economy survives this period of COVID isolation and begins to develop and modernize, and it's clear, I think, that that's still a central goal for Kim Jong-un, to fix the economy and improve people's living standards. If there's more foreign trade, if there's more investment, there's more contact, there are more exchanges, that over time, inexorably, that will lead to some greater opening and more personal choices for ordinary people. So I think you have to see human rights as a very incremental process, that banging on now about how terrible it is may be objectively true, but it does nothing to improve conditions for the people who are living there, and only adds another obstacle to the process of breaking down all the distrust and ill will. Let me just say a couple of things on the diplomatic front. It seems we are in danger of overlooking one critical point, that North Korea since 2017 has maintained its moratorium on nuclear tests and long-range missile tests. And for Kim Jong-un, that was a really big concession. And I think it's fair to say that in North Korean eyes, the US has so far not come up with a comparable concession. And when the signals we're seeing now from the North Koreans are not that it's impossible to have dialogue or diplomacy with the United States, but the ball's in Washington's court, and the North is looking for a big gesture. For example, reiterating what Secretary of State Pompeo said about American goal of achieving a fundamentally different strategic relationship between our two countries, or reaffirming the Singapore communique. When the North concludes, if the North concludes that's not on the cards, then I think we'll begin to see a cycle of further escalation and provocation as it moves ahead, doing all the things that it's held off doing, and then we'll really be in trouble. But the door is not yet shut, and we're early in the Biden administration, so it's not impossible that this dynamic is going to could unfold in a different and slightly more constructive way. But I have to say, having watched this for a long time, I'm not optimistic either.